I greet you as fellow members of the Holy Church of God, and in the name of two of its instances, its gatherings. First, on behalf of the Anglican Center in Rome, and secondly, in the name of my particular Christian family, All Saints Anglican Church here in the city of Rome. The Anglican Center was established in the early 1960s as an embassy of the Archbishop of Canterbury to the Holy See, as a way of fostering understanding and fellowship between parts of the larger church that needed discussion and dialogue and a greater experience of each other. All Saints Anglican Church, in various guises, has ministered in the city of Rome since 1816, and some of you who are signed in or watching this today will be members of that fellowship. But there will be others, folks who either by accident or design have joined us. And Lent is a time for that, a time which is bracketed off, a time to make new associations, to do things differently for a time. We encounter new things, we think new thoughts, and perhaps we meet new people. And so we are overjoyed to have you with us today. Our reflections over the next few weeks will focus on the experience of wilderness. The stories are those of Moses in the land of Midian, the people of Israel in the wilderness, Elijah in his cave, and Jesus in the desert being tempted by the devil. They are stories of both deprivation and provision, both loss and gain, because wilderness is more than merely stripping away our goods and usual comforts. Wilderness is also about finding our food in different places and our direction in different ways. And we will be careful not only to talk about giving things up, but about putting things on as well. To work, let us hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And I am reading to you from the 2nd and 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. So Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to share a meal." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for help rose up to God from their slavery. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, and yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here am I." The background to this story is as follows. Moses was doing his best to lose the Egyptian accent that people had remarked on when he first landed in rural Midian. This great hero of the Hebrew people was referred to in Midian as the Egyptian. It was the way he formed his words. His expressions were not local expressions. Some of his grammar was perhaps ski-whiff, and he was trying his best to speak like a local. Some of you here this evening have learned Italian, or if you are expats somewhere else, maybe French or German. You might have applied yourself to the language, but you are still a child of Stoke-on-Trent or Badger's Elbow, Nebraska, and you will forever betray your origins, no matter how good your Italian or your French is. So it was with Moses, but in his case, he had his own reasons for wanting to fit in, for wanting to lie low, keep his head beneath the parapet. His accent was an accent worth losing. First of all, it was a lie. He wasn't Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. He'd been a Hebrew child raised like a dirty secret in the heart of the Egyptian court. Secondly, his Egyptian accent provided a clue to his past misdeeds. The child became a man back in Egypt. His identity crisis sharpened and caused him to snap. He'd killed an Egyptian overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave, and thus became a fugitive from Egyptian justice. His photo, I suppose, was posted in the post office. He was one of the most wanted, and a reckoning awaited him should he ever return. Moses dodged a murder charge. He walked the width of the desert and crossed the border into Midian. He married the daughter of a local prominent family and began to work on his pension. Did he have nightmares? Did the ghosts of Egypt haunt his sleep? There's no evidence of this. On the day our reading takes place, Moses is following the flocks as he would have done seasonally. He would have appeared from a distance before he opened his mouth like a perfectly ordinary Midianite shepherd on a perfectly regular day with only the barest trace of an accent. Everything is on track. You see, Moses landed on his feet. He'd escaped the murder charge and gone to work for his father-in-law Jethro as a shepherd. On the day in question, he was taking care of Jethro's sheep. And he might have taken time to imagine that when Jethro went to his reward, these sheep would one day be his sheep. These flocks, this country, this life would be his flocks, his country, his life. Egypt was all behind him, and even more remote was the intrigue of having been a hidden Hebrew in the Egyptian court. And it was that complicated life that Moses had put behind him, one that had been filled with risks since his childhood. So what is the recipe for a guy like Moses in this new land? The recipe for what Moses needed to do is exactly what every new parolee needs to do upon his release from prison. He needs to keep his eyes forward and to follow the path and to seize the opportunity at hand. When you are given a new start and limited time, you stick to the straight and narrow. It's the same at the tail end of the world's worst divorce, or of a personal bankruptcy, or of a war, or of a natural disaster. It's the same when you come to a new country as a refugee. You need to just put one foot in front of the other. That's how the wall gets built. Chapter is added to chapter until the conclusion is reached and the story can coast to a reasonable end. Moses needs to do one thing, which is to keep his eye on the ball. It's not complicated. These fat sheep must be directed down the straight path to market, nothing else. At this point in the story, something twinkles on the horizon as a bush spontaneously ignites into flame. This would be as good a place as any to insert your sigh into the story, because the story of Moses does not end with a straight line, a steady state, and a predictable trajectory. There are chapters to come in Moses' life that the young man cannot even imagine. You and I do not know him as a Midianite shepherd. We know him as someone else. The story of Moses commissioning by God to go back into Egypt, and the whole story of the Exodus, the pivotal chapter in Israel's history, doesn't begin with God commanding Moses to take off his shoes in front of a burning bush, or God's explanation of how he will be sent back into Egypt to rescue his people. It actually begins a few chapters earlier with the fateful words that Moses pronounced at the end of our reading. I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. Maybe you have a family member who is easily distracted, who loses sight of the plot quickly, who reacts impulsively, who has been criticized by his family members, by teachers in school, by employers, by the man or woman he is married to. They get everything arranged and in order, and then poof, it disappears. Were you chided by teachers, coaches, well-meaning uncles about not following the straight line? Would you not have been further ahead if you had refined your resources and learned to concentrate? Keep yourself from distraction at all costs. Curiosity may kill the cat. It may displease the parole officer, but it also ushers in new epochs in history. And from one cover of the Bible to the other, and throughout the history of the church, God upsets the settled and recommended paths of men and women so that they can become prophets, patriarchs, disciples, and saints. Before they were ever useful to God and his kingdom by being resolute and unshakable, they proved their worth because they were quite the opposite. They were capable of being distracted from their day jobs and unstuck from all their several necessary trajectories. God could depend on them to shift their gaze from their desks and direct it out the window. So if you want, or if you need it, consider this to be permission from a local vicar and permission from the biblical tradition, the sacred story in which we all stand, to use your time in the wilderness in this Lent, not only to put things off, but to rediscover new things for the very first time. Not what you've always done, but here in a new place, because I suspect that I may be speaking to a great many expats, but to notice what is there in your fellowships, amongst the people in whose presence you live. What twinkles on the horizon for you?